Chapter 6 deals with bony tissue and the skeletal system. Overall functions of the skeletal system are to help support various organs. It helps provide movement because the muscles are attached to them. It provides protection for a lot of your fragile organs. Helps to produce blood cells, your red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and also is involved with storing and also releasing minerals. So for the support, movement, and protection, when I say the skeletal system, it's supporting the whole rest of the body. Without the skeletal system, we would just be this meat heap of glob. There'd be no structure to us whatsoever. So it's helping to support. The bones provide attachment points for muscles. That's helping to support the muscles, and then when the muscles contract, because they are attached to the bones, that means the bones are going to move. So that's how it's able to help provide movement. Once again, you're seeing where two systems work very closely together, the muscular system and the skeletal system, to have nice movement, coordinated movement. Most of the vital organs, such as your heart, your brain, are surrounded by bone. It's providing protection for those fragile organs. And this diagram is showing, or this picture is showing, how the brain is surrounded by bone. It's providing that extra protection. I thought this was just kind of an interesting picture to see, because you usually see either just the skull or just the brain. But you can see how you've got the skin surrounding the scalp, is surrounding the skull, and then that is protecting the brain itself. In terms of mineral storage, there are several different types of minerals that are stored in the bone. Two of the most common ones are phosphorus and calcium. And so when you think about what do you mean it's stored in the bone, it's in that bone matrix. Remember, bone is a connective tissue. Connective tissue has the cells, and then this extracellular substance around the cells is the matrix. For bone, obviously, that matrix is very hard, and it is made up of several minerals, and so it acts as a reservoir. It's a storage place for them. When you have excess minerals, let's take calcium. You have excess calcium, and normally it's going to be monitored in the blood. So that's where the body's looking at, where it's monitoring, and it's allowed to be within a certain range. If it goes above that range, the concentration of it goes too high, then the body wants to bring it down, bring that concentration down. So what will it do with the calcium? As you'll find out throughout the semester in studying A&P and physiology, that there are several different things it can do. In terms of the bone, it can take that excess calcium and have it deposited into the bone matrix. It stores it there. Now, if the levels of, like say we're talking about calcium, drop too low, so you're at a deficient level, you need to increase it. What do? Well, you pull it from the bone. You pull now that calcium out of that matrix. There are certain things that will be stimulated where it will break the calcium and leach it out of that matrix. So that's how it's used as a storage. In terms of energy storage, bones are a site for fat storage. Fat is a form of energy storage, if you will. It can be fat cells can be broken down, released energy for use, the lipids. So there is some fat that's stored. The interior of your long bones, like your femur, your humerus, is filled with bone marrow. That bone marrow is a type of very soft connective tissue. Yellow marrow, there's yellow marrow and red marrow. Yellow marrow has adipose, and it has those fat cells, so that's where it gets stored. Specifically, you've got triglycerides that are stored in that adipose tissue, and certainly that's used for energy. Hematopoiesis is production of blood cells. This will occur in the red marrow. And so you can see in this cross section of the bone that in the interior portion of it, you do have the red marrow, and then you also have yellow marrow. So how do we classify bones? Because you know in biology we're going to classify everything. So we do classify bones as one of 5 different types. You have long bones, which as the name implies, they're very long in nature. They tend to function as a lever. Oftentimes muscles are attached to these to provide movement. You have short bones. These usually are used to help stabilize an area. They're used for support. Flat bones are often used for protection and once again muscle attachment. Irregular bones, as the name implies, you really can't fit that shape in anything else. An example would be like your vertebrae. It's often used once again for support and protection. Sesamoid bones, these are bones that are found embedded within tendons. Tendons tend to have a lot of pressure on them, and so it kind of helps to protect the tendon. The most common sesamoid bone is the patella, which is your kneecap. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that other tendons have much smaller sesamoid bones in it, but the number may vary, the location may vary between individuals. So where mine are may be very different from yours, but everybody has a patella. And that's what this diagram or picture is just showing, different examples of these bones, such as, once again, your long bone. You have short bones typically found in like the foot and in the hand. Here is a sesamoid bone, the patella, that's actually embedded in the tendon. Here's a flat bone, the sternum. They're also found oftentimes in the skull. And then irregular. I mean, here's a vertebrae. How are you going to classify that? Well, it's not long, it's not flat, it's not short. So it's kind of it's not embedded in the tendon. So where do you place it? It's in that catch-all category of irregular. And this table is showing once again the different bone classifications, what their function is, different little features about it, but some examples, and I think knowing some of these examples helps. When we look at the gross anatomy of the bone, typically what we will look at is a long bone, because the long bone tends to have all of these different features in them. And once again, there's going to be vocabulary that you need to know. The shaft of a long bone, that middle portion of it, is known as the diaphysis. The epiphysis is the end of the long bone. Now, your long bones, oftentimes you're talking about the bones in your arms and your legs, and so there's going to be a proximal end and a distal end. Once again, see how these terms come back. So the proximal end, remember, is going to be the point closest to the point of attachment to the torso, to the rest of the body. Distal end is going to be the far end. So you may see on diagrams or hear someone talk about the distal epiphysis. Well, that would be the end of the long bone that's farthest away from the point of attachment. The medullary cavity is the hollow cavity that's in the diaphysis, in that shaft. And we're going to talk about how the bone is formed. Initially it's filled, but as you age and the bone is developing, it becomes hollow in the middle of the diaphysis. And it forms this cavity, and this was known as the medullary cavity. Usually what happens is that it's going to be filled in adults with yellow marrow. In children, it initially is filled with red marrow. In adults, it changes over to the yellow marrow. Remember, we just said yellow marrow has adipose cells in it, which has the triglycerides, which can be used for energy storage. Now, you're also going to have a lot of blood vessels and nerves running through that medullary cavity. Another feature that we see, especially on the long bones, is the epiphyseal plate. This is commonly referred to as the gross plate. It's essentially where the diaphysis and the epiphysis meet. The thing is, where they meet, when you have a child or an adolescent who has not finished growing yet, Where the diaphysis and epiphysis meet on this epiphyseal plate, it contains hyaline cartilage. You still have growing bone there. It's adding to the length of the bone. Once a person has stopped growing in height, that epiphyseal plate becomes what we call the epiphyseal line. You, on an x-ray, can see it's usually much thinner than the epiphyseal plate, but you can see where it once was. If you were to, say, find remains and you took x-rays of the bones, you can help get an idea of the age of the individual by looking to see if you have long bones. Is it an epiphyseal plate or is it an epiphyseal line? If it's a line, that means that the individual has already reached early adulthood. If it's an epiphyseal plate, the individual was still a child. They were still actively growing in height. So when we look at a picture of a long bone, once again, the shaft area, this is the diaphysis. The ends, you've got the epiphysis on either end. In this particular drawing, this is the femur. And so this would be the proximal epiphysis, this would be the distal epiphysis. You tend to have articular cartilage on the end of the bone that's going to be involved with the joint. That's going to help reduce friction so you don't have bone on bone. You can see here in the middle of this cavity, that is the medullary cavity. You can see the little yellow here, it's the yellow marrow. And like I said, you do have blood supply coming in. This little line right up here that you can see, that is the epiphyseal line that I was talking about. We will see a more detailed picture in just a moment. Still continuing looking at the gross anatomy, what you can see, the periosteum. Osteum refers to bone, so whenever you see that osteum, that's going to clue you in you're talking about the bone. Periosteum is this fibrous membrane that's covering the outside of bone. It does contain blood vessels, it'll contain lymphatic vessels, it'll contain nerves. This is the point of attachment for a lot of tendons and ligaments, and it almost becomes continuous then with it. It just sort of merges, like the end of the tendon or the end of the ligament just merges with the periosteum. It's a protective layer for the bone. The endosteum, endo means in, so this is going to be the membrane inside the bone, and it's actually lining the interior part of the bone around the medullary cavity. And then, like I said, that articular cartilage is going to be on the end of bones, so it's on the epiphysis. It can act as a shock absorber, and like I said, it's very important in a joint that it's reducing that friction. Oftentimes what happens with an individual who has arthritis is that articular cartilage starts to wear away. Oftentimes that has to do with age and genetics and maybe exposure to different things over the course of your life and wear and tear on. And if that cartilage ends up completely wearing away, you've got bone rubbing on bone, which is extremely painful. So this picture is similar to the one we saw previously. However, it's a few more things are labeled on it. So once again, your articular cartilage up on the proximal epiphysis, and then the diaphysis here. Here's your medullary cavity once again. The membrane that would be lining the inside of this cavity is the endosteum. This membrane that is covering the outside of the bone along here is the periosteum. And as you can see, once again, the blood vessels coming into the medullary cavity are shown here. Your book chapter has a little bit about bone markings. We tend to cover this more in the laboratory setting where you are going to be learning the names of the various bones. Just know that whenever we talk about articulations, that's a joint. It's just a fancy word for joint. And then we often talk about projections and holes. Projections are just any type of a marking on the bone. It rises above the surface of the bone, and it's usually where ligaments and tendons are going to be attaching. And then there's various types of names for holes, fissures, foramens, etc. And we give them different names depending on the size of them oftentimes. Why is there going to be a hole? Well, you have to oftentimes have an opening for these blood vessels, for these lymphatic vessels, for the nerves to pass from outside the bone to the interior portion of the bone. And sometimes you may have grooves along the bones where the blood vessels and nerves and lymphatic vessels tend to be lying in there. And so this is just giving some examples of these. You know, where in a projection is where you have anything rising above the surface of what the bone would be. And then these indentations and holes help for joints where two bones may come together. You're going to have bone come in here at that joint. Like I say, you often have these holes that are allowing for blood vessels to go through. The base of the skull, you have the foramen magnum, which is where the spinal cord comes through the skull and attaches to the brain. But like I said, most of these will be covered in your lab portion. So when you look at the bone, there's several different types of cells that help come together to form this osseous or bone tissue. It is connective tissue, so remember it does have that extracellular matrix. The matrix does contain inorganic mineral crystals and the collagen fibers. These inorganic mineral or salt crystals, they provide strength and hardness characteristics to the bone, and then the collagen fibers provide some flexibility. You don't want a lot of flexibility, but you do want to have a little bit of give and take with the bone whenever there's pressure on it. So there's four main types of cells in the bone. These four main types of bone cells are called the osteoblasts, osteocytes, osteoclasts, and osteogenic cells. And I know it gets a little frustrating because they're all so similar. Osteoblast is going to help form new bone. That's its purpose. Osteoclast, down here at the bottom, is going to be breaking down the bone matrix. So whenever you're breaking down bone, it's going to involve the osteoclast. Whenever you're making new bone, it's going to involve the osteoblast. Where does the osteoblast come from? Well, the osteogenic cell, excuse me, is a cell that is going, it starts off as the osteogenic cell, but it's going to ultimately form the osteoblast. Differentiate means it's going to specialize. So it's all of your osteoblasts start out as an osteogenic cell first. And then the osteocyte, excuse me, this is found in the lacunae in these, under the microscope, they look like these little clear vessels. They basically are regulatory because they're going to regulate basically the mineral concentration of the bone matrix. In other words, it's going to regulate, oh, we need to make new bone, then it's going to stimulate the osteoblast. If you need to break down some of the bone, then it's going to stimulate the osteoclast. So think of it in some ways maybe as this is the osteocyte's like the parent that's trying to regulate and keep an eye on these two cells. Don't let either one get a little carried away. I'm watching over you, and I'm going to control how active you're going to be. And so this is just kind of showing in a cross-section of a bone how you have the osteocytes that are going to be regulating the osteoblast, which forms the new bone, and the osteoclast, which breaks it down, and the osteogenic cell is essentially like a stem cell that's going to differentiate into the osteoblast. Now, when we talk about bones, we talk about either compact bone or spongy bone, usually. Compact bone is very dense. It's always going to be the most superficial layer. It's very strong. You want it to be the outermost superficial layer because of its strength. The structural unit is called an osteon. Once again, I know all these words sound so similar. It's a structural unit. What it looks like, concentric rings, we call them lamellae. What the osteon is, the concentric rings, concentric ring, remember, is going to be where you have a series of rings and start off small, and they have a little bit larger ring around that one, and then a third ring around the second one. And it's very distinctive in what it looks like. In the very middle of that is what we call the central canal. Older books call it the Haversian canal. So once again, here we go. We got multiple names. It's the same thing. But it's going to be right in the very middle, and that's where blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves are supplying the internal part of the bone. How do those blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves get to the middle? Well, there's a little side channels, if you will, that are at 90-degree angles or at right angles to that central canal. That goes, remember, the periosteum is on the surface of the bone, and the endosteum is on the inner surface of the medullary cavity. These both have living tissue. Well, that's fine that the periosteum can get nutrients and oxygen, etc., from the blood on the surface of the bone, but how are you going to get it inside to the endosteum, which also needs those nutrients and oxygen? You're going to have those blood vessels going in there. You're going to have nerves going in there. So they will go at these right angles that are known as the perforating canals or the Volkmann's canals. So in this diagram up here, here is the outer surface of the bone. And that is where the periosteum is going to be. You can see right here, it's kind of pulled away just a little bit, just to show it. So you've got your blood vessels here. And usually wherever you have blood vessels, you're also going to have nerves. You have an area here of this compact bone, the one that I'm saying is very dense, it's very strong. You have the lamellae, the osteon is the functional unit right here. See how it's concentric circles? And in the middle is the central canal, which has the blood vessels, and the typically in your drawings, the yellow is going to be nerves. How did they get there? Because, right, so this would be your Haversian or central canal. And then over here is your perforating or Volkmann's canal. So it's at right angles. It comes from the periosteum and is going to hit this central canal. Then you're going to have another perforating canal right here to connect to an inner central canal. And then some of these doesn't show up, but down here you may have another perforating canal to get out to the spongy bone out here. So you have kind of this whole network of kind of like scaffolding at 90-degree angles to each other. So central canal, perforating canals. That's the way you get the blood supply in there. And under a microscope, like I say, it's very distinctive what the compact bone looks like with these concentric circles around like this. Spongy bone, now what you're going to have is lacunae and osteocytes, but it's in more of a like a lattice. It definitely looks like this open lattice work scaffolding, and that lattice work we tend to call the trabeculae. It looks very randomly placed, but it actually is very strategically placed. If you look at this picture down here, see, it looks like a sponge, which is why it's called spongy bone. And you're like, oh my goodness, it's got all these little things. Seems like that could break fairly easily. Well, number one, that's why it's not on the outer surface. That's why you have the compact bone And then the spongy bone is going to be on the interior portion, whether it's a flat bone, long bone, etc. The spongy bone is always going to be on the internal part. Now, in the skull, this is just showing it's almost like a sandwich. Spongy bone, because it's more open, it's much lighter. This is important in the skull that you're able to hold your head up then. If the bones of the skull were all nothing but compact bone, there'd be a lot more weight. You wouldn't be able to hold your head up. What's in this open spaces? Red marrow is in there. Just kind of FYI, they actually, there's a paper years ago of where a biologist asked a structural engineer to look at how the tuberculi were arranged in spongy bone. Essentially, it doesn't make sense because it looks like it'd be really fragile. And when they analyzed it, the response was that from an engineering standpoint, it's extremely well designed to take stresses from different areas, different directions. So your spongy bone, this is showing on a long bone up here on the end of the epiphyse, is usually spongy bone. Down in the diaphyse is usually compact bone, but you can see how the tuberculi look like this. I usually describe it like scaffolding or lattice work in there. And then you still have your osteocytes and your osteoclasts in there, etc. The nutrient form in this is usually an opening that's found in the diaphyse that does allow those blood vessels and the nerve to pass from the exterior into those internal components. They'll start the breaking down to the perforating canals so it can reach the central canals and eventually pass to the medullary cavity, servicing the spongy bone right before it gets there. Nerves tend to be more concentrated in the metabolically active areas of the bone. But just keep in mind that bone has a very good supply of blood because the cells are very actively growing. Even if you have stopped growing in height, your bones are constantly going through remodeling processes depending on the stresses that you place on them. And so there's constant growth, repair, and it needs a very good blood supply for that. Why? Because it needs the oxygen and the nutrients. It needs to get rid of the waste products. And certainly it needs to have a good nerve supply to help control the communication of what is going on. What does that mean for you? If any of you have ever had the misfortune of breaking a bone, you're going to know it. It's going to be painful and it's going to bleed. So once again, this picture is just showing this extensive blood supply and nerve supply that is present in the interior portion of the bone. So how does bone form? How does it develop? Ossification is this process of bone development. Bone is considered as a replacement tissue. It just doesn't magically appear. You usually start with something else, be it cartilage, be it a mesenchymal tissue, membrane. It starts as something else and then it gets whatever that original tissue was, the bone tissue is going to replace it. Cartilage is often used as the template for the bones and gets replaced. So when does this ossification, this bone development occur? It starts occurring during fetal development and it will continue through adolescence. Now modifications of the bone, depending on stress that appears on a particular area of a bone, that will determine different modifications that can occur throughout your life. Intramembranous ossification, there's two main types of ossification. So this is the first one we will talk about. This is where bone, it develops directly from the mesenchymal connective tissue. Mesenchymal is a type of an embryonic connective tissue. This happens in a lot of your facial bones, most of the cranial bones, the bones in the head, and the clavicle. What tends to happen is these mesenchymal cells tend to congregate in certain areas, and they start to differentiate into capillaries, osteogenic cells, and osteoblasts. The osteoblasts, they secrete this matrix that's called osteoid that doesn't have any calcium in it yet. So initially it's not hard, but it will in a few days start to harden up. So the osteogenic cells, remember they're like a stem cell, and they become osteoblasts. So your osteogenic cells become osteoblasts. Your osteoblasts are secreting this matrix, which is going to start hardening in a few days. As it starts to harden, if a cell is secreting this matrix and it starts to harden all around it, it becomes trapped in it. It's completely embedded in that matrix. So the osteoblasts, once they are embedded in the matrix, they become osteocytes. The osteoblasts on the surface of the matrix, they're on the surface, they become the periosteum. So start seeing how everything's connected. Osteogenic cells become the osteoblasts, which are secreting the matrix. And when you get stuck in the matrix, as an osteoblast, now you become an osteocyte, which is going to be, remember the osteocytes. Later on we said as development continues, we mentioned earlier that the osteocytes basically are the ones regulating osteoblast and osteoclast. So it's all tightly regulated. So here's just showing you mesenchymal cells, your collagen fibers that are present in this membrane, because this is a type of connective tissue. And here you've got your osteoblasts. They start to secrete this matrix, which we call the osteoid. So now what's happening is starting to harden. Here you've got some of your osteoblasts on the surface. Once the matrix hardens around these cells, which were initially an osteoblast, now they've become an osteocyte. You've got that hardened matrix around them. Those osteoblasts that were on the surface are now starting to form the periosteum. You've got your blood vessels forming. This is, remember, all during fetal development. Until finally now you've got your periosteum, you've got your osteoblast here on the surface, which if they're going to be making new bone, that's where they need to be, is on the surface. This upper layer here is going to be your compact bone, down here is going to be your spongy bone. It's going to be filled with red marrow. You've got your blood supply in there. It's all tightly regulated. Endochondral ossification is when bone develops by replacing cartilage, and it's usually hyaline cartilage. Examples of this is with your long bones. So now your mesenchymal cells, they will differentiate into chondrocytes. Chondrocytes, remember, are making the cartilage, and the perichondrium appears later, which is going to become eventually the periosteum. After birth, ossification will continue at this epiphyseal plate of the long bones. The steps basically that are going to occur is you have your matrix mineralization. It starts to harden. As that happens, you're going to have your chondrocytes dying. Then you have invasion of the blood vessels from your periosteum. They're going to start extending through there. And the blood vessels are going to be bringing with them some of your osteogenic cells, which, remember, what do? They become your osteoblasts. So in this diagram here, remember it starts as the hyaline cartilage. It's kind of like you've got a template formed here. During ossification, what do? You need to replace this cartilage with the bone cells. So initially the perichondrium. This matrix starts to become a little bit hardened in the middle. It usually always starts along the diaphysis first. Eventually now you're starting to form your periosteum. You're forming your spongy bone in the middle. Here's the nutrient artery extending out. So it's like you start in the middle and you start extending towards the ends, either end of you're extending toward that epiphysis area, so that eventually you've got your medullary cavity formed with your blood supply in here. You've got spongy bone here, and in the middle, right along there, where the diaphysis and the epiphysis meet, is where your epiphyseal plate is, and that is where you're going to, after birth, continue to have this ossification occurring, this bone growth occurring. So it starts during the fetal development, but it will continue with growth. The bone is going to be growing in length, as we'll see at this epiphyseal plate. When does this stop? It will stop when growth stops in adolescence. Once you've had your final growth phase, your spurt, it will stop. So for bone growth and length, it occurs at that epiphyseal plate. You have, just very quick kind of summary, we'll get into details in just a moment. The cartilage is formed on the epiphyseal side of that epiphyseal plate. Epiphyseal plate connects the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So on the epiphyseal side, it is cartilage, and on the diaphysis side is where the ossification is occurring, that new bone growth. So it's the diaphysis that's growing in length. The epiphysis really is not, it's the diaphysis that's growing in length. At what rate is it growing? It's going to be controlled by hormones. Nutrition and diet can also have an effect on it, but it's a huge factor is hormones. Once you have reached, as I mentioned earlier, your full height, and the growth in terms of height has stopped, that epiphyseal plate is really replaced with epiphyseal line. And once again, you can see that on x-rays. There's 4 different zones of activity within this area for ossification to occur. The first zone is called the reserve zone. This is closest to the epiphysis. This is helping to attach the epiphyseal plate to the epiphysis, the bone tissue of the epiphysis, which is often spongy bone. The proliferation zone is the next zone. It contains the chondrocytes, which are very actively going through mitosis. So they're very actively growing in this area. The third layer is the maturation zone. This is where the chondrocytes are going to enlarge. The matrix is starting to calcify. So it's starting to harden in there. And then the fourth zone is the zone of calcified matrix. This is closest to the diaphysis now. It's connecting the epiphyseal plate to the diaphysis. In this area, the cells are dead. Excuse me. So in this diagram, up here at the top would be the epiphysis end, and down here at the bottom is the diaphysis end. And then you can see the 4 different zones. The reserve zone, where you have the chondrocytes, you're starting to release some of that matrix, followed by proliferation, where you have mitosis occurring very rapidly. The maturation zone, your cells are going to enlarge. The matrix is now starting to calcify in here, and then the calcified matrix in this zone is where cell death has occurred. The matrix has become very strong now. So that's how you would grow in length, but how does a long bone, say, grow in diameter? It's called appositional growth. What's going to happen here, it's dependent on hormones and environmental stresses as well. Remember, your osteoclasts are removing the bone matrix. Osteoblasts are adding to the bone matrix. So what happens is the osteoclasts tend to be more interior. They're going, as they remove the bone matrix, they're going to increase the medullary cavity. The size of that's going to increase. Whereas the osteoblasts are going to be producing new bone under the periosteum on the outer surface. So it's like you take away on the inside, you add to the outside. And that's how you will grow in diameter. That is also how you're going to be responding to different stresses. If you have, when I talk about different stresses, You could actually see this and measure this. If you were to look at individuals, say at the beginning of a school year, and we all know from studies that school books are heavy, and especially, let's talk about, say, high school kids, or we could look at college kids, but let's say high school kids where they take all their classes from 8 to 4 or whatever, and they have to carry all of those books around every single day if they don't have lockers, and so the backpacks are really heavy. If you were to take x-rays and look at, say, the shoulder, and before school started, at the end of summer, you could take measurements from an x-ray and figure out, okay, how dense is the bone, etc. Do all these various measurements. And then compare, even halfway through the semester, say then in December. And we all know that most, say, high school kids, they're not wearing their backpacks over both shoulders. Many of us don't do that unless maybe we're hiking. It's so easy to just grab the back, throw it over one shoulder, and you tend to have a preference for which shoulder you're putting it on. Well, that preference, because it's always getting that backpack put on its shoulder, that extra weight, you're making adjustments for that. So one shoulder's receiving and having to deal with a lot more weight, and that's stress, that's pressure on it, than the other shoulder. And your body's going to compensate for that. The bones are going to have remodeling, and that's where we talk about remodeling that occurs throughout your life. It's adjusting to these different pressures, these different stresses that are placed on it. Now, maybe in 6 months, it'll change again. During these recent times when we've been going through this pandemic and a lot of us are at home and you're not carrying around as heavy of things, you're not carrying your backpacks, you're not carrying, depending on what your work is, maybe stuff around as much, well, then you might be seeing changes associated because of that. So you stop growth in height, but your bones are constantly remodeling throughout your life depending on your activity levels. And yes, unfortunately, sometimes things happen and you break a bone. So we give all these different terms to the types of fracture that you have. The first two classifications, whether it's open, which is also known as a compound fracture, versus closed. All that has to do with essentially is when you broke the bone, did it break the skin? Is the bone sticking out where you can visibly see it, or is the skin still intact? If it did not break the skin, it's referred to as a closed fracture. If you did break the skin, it's known as an open or a compound fracture. The problem with that, well, any broken bone is a problem, but it's going to be more severe if it's a compound fracture because the skin is broken. The skin is, remember, a physical protective barrier that prevents any type of microorganisms, especially from invading you. You just broke that. It's like the perimeter has been breached. And so you definitely have an increased risk of infection because the skin has been broken. Now, sometimes the bone may not be completely broken all the way through. That's known as a green stick. It's still a fracture, but it's a partial fracture. They'll look at if the bone is broken all the way through. Is it along the long axis, or is it kind of a spiral because there's a twisting motion with it? Are there several breaks, or is there just one break? Is it at 90 degrees to the bone or not? Does it look like one fragment was driven into the other one, like really pushed into it? So they'll look at all that from the x-rays. And then obviously set the bone, in other words, line it up properly so that you have proper healing to occur. And this diagram just shows examples of some of these different types of breaks. If it were on the femur, once again closed, there's no breakage of the skin, versus open, where it did penetrate and break the skin. Spiral, where it's usually from a twisting type of motion, etc. And green stick, where it did not go all the way through. So they can see that on the x-ray, and then do the appropriate type of treatment. So how does the bone repair itself? Naturally, what the bone's going to do, not what the doctor, but what the bone's going to do, is usually within several hours after the fracture. First step is the hematoma is formed, kind of a blood clot around. Your body wants to stop that bleeding and start the repair process and start any damage and injured tissue that's it needs to be removed. Your cells are going to remove that. Your white blood cells come in and they're cleanup crew. So you form this blood clot. Then after that, you're going to form a cartilage callus. That's going to help to stabilize the fracture, and that's usually is formed within 48 hours after the injury. After that, the cartilage is going to be replaced by a bony callus. That can take several weeks. And then after the bony callus, then the bone remodeling occurs, trying to restore it back as close as possible to what the original structure was. Now, you need to rest the area. You don't need additional stresses on the breakage area where the fracture is, so you want to rest that area, which is why they're going to try to immobilize it, allow it to heal properly. So this is showing the steps. As you can see here, you have the break, you've got the hematoma formed, you've got your blood vessels reforming here, regenerating, and supplying this active area. You've got to clean up the debris. You're going to want to start new cells, mitosis, to produce new cells to replace the damaged ones. Cleanup crew, like I said, this is the cartilage callus. Internals just on the interior part of the bone, and the externals on the superficial areas. And then that's going to be replaced by the bony callus. So you can see here that cartilage is being replaced. And then eventually, with remodeling, it will heal. You may have a little bit of swelling. Scar tissue may form where the break was, but it tries to restore it back to what its original structure was.